After the Cold War ended, locomotive factories across the former Soviet bloc kept running their production lines, even with zero orders coming in. Trains were rolling off the line with nowhere to go. Inside the walls of locomotive factories from Bryansk to Kharkiv, the rhythm of the assembly lines never faltered, even as the world outside changed overnight. The reason lay deep in the DNA of Soviet industrial planning, a system built not for markets, but for quotas. Every year, plant managers received their marching orders from Moscow, handed down through layers of ministries and enforced by a logic as rigid as the steel rails their products were meant to ride. At the heart of this machinery stood the material balance method, a kind of industrial accounting software that matched every ton of steel, every spool of copper wire, to a fixed output target. In 1989, that meant a 48% jump in locomotive production, targets set with little regard for who might actually need the trains. Meeting the quota was what mattered. The state allocated resources, paid bonuses, and kept factories running, all based on the numbers reported, not on the reality of demand. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the old planning code didn't vanish. Instead, it lingered in the spreadsheets and annual production programs that every plant still had to submit. The new governments, facing economic chaos, clung to these familiar routines. Ministries issued state-owned order books, sometimes filled with numbers that had no connection to real buyers. The plants, in turn, kept building. The logic was circular. As long as a quota existed, the assembly lines could not stop. This inertia was more than a habit. It was a survival mechanism. Subsidies and raw materials continued to flow as long as the paperwork showed production targets being met. Managers whose jobs and bonuses depended on hitting these numbers inflated order books to justify their operations. The entire system became a closed loop, with factories building trains for the sake of the plan, not the market. In the absence of outside demand, the factory's internal logic kept the wheels turning, setting the stage for an industrial paradox that would soon collide with the realities of the global market. Beyond the borders of the former Soviet Union, the world's locomotive market was already spoken for. Western manufacturers, Siemens, Alstom, and Bombardier, had carved out a near monopoly on export tenders throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s. Their grip on the industry reached far beyond the latest train models. When a national railway or freight operator issued a tender, the expectation was not just for a locomotive, but for a complete package. Integrated signaling, emissions compliance, and a full-service maintenance contract. These were standards developed and enforced through years of open market competition and international regulation, far removed from the legacy systems still rolling out of Bryansk or Kharkiv. Inside the boardrooms of these Western giants, deals were brokered with the backing of export credit agencies, and technical documentation ran thousands of pages, each clause a barrier for any outsider hoping to compete. Former Bryansk director Anatoly K. recalled the frustration in a 2021 interview. "We could build the metal, but we couldn't sell the service. Without the after-sales support, nobody in Europe or Asia would even consider our machines." The old Soviet platforms, still running on 1970s-era diesel engines and outdated traction electronics, simply couldn't clear the hurdles set by EU crashworthiness rules or emissions directives like EN 15227. Pricing was another wall. Western original equipment manufacturers bundled financing, training, and guaranteed spare parts into their bids, making their offers nearly impossible to match. Even when the sticker price of a Soviet-built locomotive looked competitive on paper, the absence of service guarantees or modern safety features made them a non-starter for most buyers. Procurement files from Russian railways show repeated attempts to place export orders, 2,000 units to Siemens, 500 to Alstom, abandoned before contract because the state couldn't deliver the financing or technical assurances required. The global market, in effect, had closed its doors. For the factories back home, the realization set in: no matter how many trains rolled off the line, there was simply no seat at the table. The output stranded in factory yards was not just the result of internal inertia, but of an external world that had moved on, leaving these plants and their workers locked out by a new set of rules. Rows of locomotives stretched for kilometers, lined up in silent formation across the yards of Bryansk, Luhansk, Kharkiv, and Novocherkassk. From above, the scale became unmistakable. Satellite images taken between 1994 and 2001 revealed a pattern that no official report could hide: a slow, relentless swelling of unused rolling stock. In Bryansk, more than 1,800 locomotives sat in a fenced grid covering 12 square kilometers. Luhansk showed 1,200 units, arranged in neat rows across 3 depots. Kharkiv's yard displayed nearly 1,000 half-assembled bodies, some exposed to the elements, others shrouded under sheets. Novocherkassk, too, held over 600 units, tarpaulins draped over the aging shells. The numbers were staggering. By the turn of the millennium, the combined inventory of idle locomotives across these 4 sites alone reached more than 5,000 units. Each represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in frozen capital, machines built to move nations left immobile. The growth wasn't a sudden spike, but a steady climb year after year, visible in time-lapse imagery analyzed by remote sensing institutes. The yards filled until there was nowhere left to park, and then the plateau began, as subsidies thinned and production finally slowed. What began as a bureaucratic exercise in meeting quotas had become a spectacle visible from space: $1 billion worth of steel and labor, gathering dust in the open air. In Bryansk, the train factory was more than a workplace. It was the anchor for an entire city. Victor S., who started on the assembly line in 1972 and rose to foreman, remembered how every paycheck rippled through the town. Victor told an oral historian in 2022 that if the plant shuts down, the town dies. This fear shaped every decision, from the boardroom to the city council. Local officials lobbied Moscow to keep the plant running, warning that a closure would mean not just lost jobs, but shuttered schools, empty apartment blocks, and a wave of families forced to leave. Union leaders, tied to the Federation of Independent Trade Unions, backed management in public, arguing that even building trains for empty yards was better than letting the assembly halls go silent. They called it social partnership, a deal where the health of the factory was tied directly to the health of the community. Emergency subsidies flowed through ministry channels, earmarked not for innovation or export, but for keeping hands busy and paychecks coming. In the 1990s, municipal budgets for housing and healthcare were quietly linked to the factory's output numbers. At the end of each month, Victor watched as the ledgers were updated, not to reflect real orders, but to keep the city's heart beating. For many in Bryansk, the piles of unused steel outside the gates were easier to ignore than the prospect of empty streets. Buried in the official ledgers of post-Soviet locomotive factories, a different kind of production line took shape, one made of numbers, not steel. Factory managers, facing the end of guaranteed demand, began padding their books with orders that only existed on paper. These phantom entries, often labeled temporary state commissions or transition period adjustments, unlocked the flow of raw materials and subsidies needed to keep the plants running. In Kharkiv, an audit by the accounts chamber later uncovered 284 diesel locomotives listed as state-commissioned units between 1993 and 1996. None of these appeared in the Ministry of Transport's central procurement system. The authorization memo, signed by Minister Sergei Petrov, described the entries as necessary to maintain material balances. It was a technical sleight of hand that turned empty promises into budgetary lifelines. Across the region, this practice was not an isolated case, but a system-wide device. The ledgers became a tool for survival, transforming fabricated demand into real financial flows. Emergency subsidies, calculated against these inflated numbers, kept the assembly lines humming even as finished locomotives piled up outside. The paperwork told one story, the yards told another. For every train that never left the factory, there was a line in the ledger that justified its existence and the next shipment of steel. On paper, the locomotives rolling out of Bryansk and Kharkiv looked like the same iron workhorses that had powered the rails for decades. But under the hood, the gap between these and their Western counterparts was growing impossible to ignore. The Soviet-era 2TE-116 diesel, still the backbone of post-Soviet production, burned through fuel at a rate nearly 15% higher than a Siemens Vectron or an Alstom Prima. Every 100 kilometers, that difference added up. It translated into thousands of liters wasted over a year, and millions lost across a national fleet. The reason was rooted in more than just old engines. Sanctions and export controls had choked off access to advanced traction converters, high-efficiency diesel modules, and emissions control systems. Design bureaus, cut off from the latest components, kept reusing blueprints from the 1970s, swapping out minor parts, but unable to touch the fundamentals. The result was a technical ceiling that no amount of local ingenuity could break. Operators faced a choice: pay the penalty in fuel and maintenance, or let the new locomotives sit unused. The factories, locked into their own supply chains, had little room to adapt. With every new unit, the gap between what was built and what the world needed grew wider, a burden measured not just in fuel bills, but in a lost decade of innovation. Inside the repair bays, maintenance crews faced a problem that could not be fixed with overtime or spare parts. The newest locomotives, fresh from Bryansk or Kharkiv, arrived with the same old wiring diagrams and control boards last seen in the late 1970s. The reason traced back to a list few outside the industry ever saw: the dual-use export controls, which blocked the import of advanced electronics, power converters, and emissions modules. After 1996, these restrictions tightened further, cutting off access to the IGBT traction modules and efficient diesel engines that made Western locomotives reliable and easy to service. Without these components, every attempt at a technical upgrade stalled. Engineers kept reusing outdated Soviet designs, swapping out whatever parts they could source locally, but the fundamentals never changed. The effect rippled down the line. In Latvia, a newly built 2TE-166U broke down just weeks after its first run on the Riga to Ventspils corridor in 1998, sidelined by a catastrophic converter failure. The story echoed across the region. Locomotives burned out, were sidelined for months, and racked up repair bills that outpaced any savings on purchase price. Operators paid a hidden premium. Maintenance costs for these units ran 30% higher than for a Siemens Vectron, year after year. For the crews tasked with keeping the trains moving, it was a cycle of patchwork fixes and mounting frustration, all rooted in a supply chain that had left them behind. Even if a genuine buyer had stepped forward in the late 1990s, the factories were boxed in by obstacles that went far beyond the shop floor. Export deals required more than just trains. They demanded complex financing, international safety certification, and the ability to scale up deliveries on tight deadlines. Western manufacturers offered export credit guarantees through agencies like Hermes or Coface, making their bids nearly risk-free for foreign customers. Bryansk and Kharkiv, by contrast, could not secure these guarantees. Russian and Ukrainian ministries lacked the hard currency reserves and credit ratings needed to backstop multi-million-dollar export contracts. Without state-backed insurance, or working state frontiers, foreign railways saw every deal as a gamble. Technical hurdles proved just as fatal. EU crashworthiness standards, such as EN 15227, set strict requirements for structural integrity and passenger safety. Most Soviet-era locomotives failed these tests outright. Certification files from 1997 show repeated rejections. Units built for Poland and Hungary were denied entry after failing impact and emissions checks. Even when a contract seemed possible, the plants struggled to ramp up production or provide after-sales support. The infrastructure for global logistics, spare parts delivery, and on-site training simply did not exist. As a result, deals collapsed before a single locomotive left the yard. The gap between what these factories could build and what the market demanded was not just technical or financial. It was a chasm, impossible to cross with the tools at hand. In Novocherkassk, the factory gates swung open for a new production run in March 2024. 120 VL10NG electric locomotives, each one gleaming with fresh paint and promises of modernized control software. But the order books told a familiar story. No confirmed buyers, no signed contracts, just a press release touting reliability and a nod toward the future. Industry analysts raised an eyebrow. The timing, they noted, coincided neatly with the approach of the regional elections. The mayor, standing in front of the plant's entrance for the cameras, declared these locomotives proof of the city's industrial strength. "We build for tomorrow," he insisted, sidestepping questions about where exactly these trains would go. Out back, the yard filled again. The cycle, it seemed, refused to break. New units rolled off the line, destined to wait for a buyer who might never come. The numbers looked different, but the logic remained unchanged. After 2014, the economic screws tightened further. New rounds of sanctions from the European Union and the United States did not just block finished locomotives. They targeted the parts that made modern upgrades possible. Advanced semiconductor chips, high-strength steel, and precision gearboxes disappeared from the supply chain almost overnight. For the factories in Bryansk and Novocherkassk, this meant waiting months for components that once arrived in weeks. Internal reports from 2015 show a 30% jump in lead times for critical parts. The cost of building each locomotive doubled within 2 years, driven by the scramble to source substitute materials and the need to redesign around missing technology. The official ban list grew with every new diplomatic spat, forcing engineers to patch together solutions with what was left on hand. Every extra month waiting for a part meant more money tied up in unfinished inventory, more pressure on already stretched budgets, and a heavier burden on the state to keep the assembly lines moving. The politics of isolation turned every new locomotive into a costlier and slower gamble, compounding the legacy of an industry already struggling to find its place in a world that had moved on. Factories like Bryansk and Kharkiv were never just production sites. They were monuments to a certain vision of progress. For decades, the act of building trains was inseparable from the idea of national strength. Even as the world around them changed, the factories clung to this identity, sometimes at staggering cost. At a 2019 roundtable, an industry analyst put it plainly. For some countries, the locomotive is not just a machine. It is a symbol that the nation is still moving forward even if the tracks lead nowhere. That belief carried weight far beyond economics. The decision to keep assembly lines running, year after year, became a way to avoid confronting the loss of purpose that followed the collapse of central planning. The idle inventory, thousands of locomotives and millions of hours of skilled labor, was the price paid for preserving a sense of continuity. Behind every unsold train stood a community, a workforce, and a political system unwilling to let go of its industrial past. The real cost, as one analyst warned, was not measured in rubles or idle steel, but in the opportunity lost to imagine something new. Today, some former Soviet locomotive plants stand silent, while others still struggle to redefine their role. The lesson isn't just economic, it's existential. When an industry loses its reason for being, the real challenge is rebuilding a purpose that fits the present. As global economies shift, the cost of clinging to outdated systems grows. What we choose to preserve and why shapes our future more than any machine ever built.